In the last occasion, we are talking about the way commerce actually acted as the main dynamic in British expansion. And the first region which came to be affected by the desire for the company to extract as much commercial advantage as possible or to create a territorial foothold was Bengal. So, not unnaturally, Bengal was described as the British bridgehead by one of the distinguished historians in recent times. So, it's important for us to look a little more closely at the way between, say, 1757 and 1765, the nominal independence of Bengal that Murshid Quli Khan, as the Subadar of Bengal, had created earlier in the 18th century, was destroyed. The formal domination of the company as a part of the Mughal government was created, was established in 1765, and within 6-7 years, virtually Bengal became the nucleus of the emerging British Empire in India, with a huge army, with huge resources, enabling the British to move westwards towards North India and finally to Delhi. Historians have talked about the different stages of imperialism from different perspectives. So one can actually look at the way over time commercial interest became less important than the desire by the British to sell their industrial products to India or to create possibilities of profitable investment of their money in Indian infrastructure, in railways, in plantation. So that is one way of looking at it. The other way, of course, is to look at the gradual territorial expansion, military expansion, how the bridgehead eventually enabled the British to cross other territories, to cross other boundaries, to create finally this large empire at the subcontinent. Murshid Quli Khan had been able to create a fairly stable political base of a regional dynasty. So it is important to ask this question of why ultimately a stable region, a prosperous region, a dynasty which has been able to keep order, which has been able to strike its roots in the region deeply, how is it that this region became the first target of the British and eventually passed into their control? Some scholars talk about a conspiracy that was going on in Bengal, even from Aligarh this time, and the conspiracy began to bear fruits during the time when Siraj-ud-Dawla, a haughty young man, became the Nawab. The origin of this particular theory goes back to a British scholar writing in the early part of the 20th century, whose name is S.C. Hill. Now, this man tried to argue that in the province of Bengal, there was a seismic rift, there was a schism between the Hindus and the Muslims. The Hindus became alienated by Siraj's misdemeanors, Siraj's various activities, and the Hindu bankers and traders, men like Jagat Sheth, had been leading a certain faction to unseat Siraj and to replace him with a more pliable person. Now, this particular thesis is no longer acceptable on the ground that if there was a rift or if there was a conspiracy at all, then in this conspiracy both Hindus and Muslims together plotted against the Nawab, and also both Hindus and Muslims together fought on the Nawab's side. So the question of a Hindu conspiracy dividing the region or dividing the polity or creating dissidences in the state or in the province is not a very valid theory. But there was a certain intrigue. There was an atmosphere of intrigue, and this atmosphere actually was visible even before Siraj-ud-Dawla became the Nawab, because the family itself from which Aligarh came was involved in frequent intrigues against one another. Think of Aligarh's usurpation. Aligarh became Nawab by usurping the throne, by deposing Sarfaraz Khan, who was the son-in-law of Murshid Quli Khan. Now, it is true that Jagat Sheth, who was a very close associate of Aligarh, who supported Aligarh's candidature or continued to support him, ultimately managed through his influence in the court of Delhi, managed to acquire legitimacy for Ali Bardi Khan. So that is there. So it is not as if that the Hindus were so hostile to the Nawab that they were deliberately participating in this conspiracy. But one should always remember that in the 18th century context, there were competing court factions. Some of these factions would always like to see one of their nominees as Nawab by excluding someone who is not so pliable. So Mir Jafar, who was the nominee of the court clerk, also became the nominee of the British for other considerations. For Mir Jafar actually agreed to give the British certain amount of compensations and rewards. So even though conspiracy theory in the way it was cast early in the 20th century is not acceptable, and historians in search of long-term causes would not give much emphasis on the argument about conspiracy, but it is a fact that in the mid-18th century Bengal, when Siraj-ud-Dawla became the Nawab, some of his actions, some of his haughty behavior had alienated certain powerful sections of the local society, including trading classes, including bankers like Jagat Sheth, who had always been very supportive to the local dynasty, including very powerful groups of courtiers led by men like Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar was a part of that family. So this is a very contentious argument, but one cannot simply dispense with it altogether. There is a very interesting work, a very important work by a man like Brijan Gupta. The title of the book is Siraj-ud-Dawla and the East India Company, in which Brijan Gupta tried to argue that despite the appearance of stability, the regime in Murshidabad had certain fundamental weaknesses. These weaknesses, according to Brijan Gupta, arose from the way Murshid Quli was alienating Hindu landowners by forcing them to pay more than they could, or by summoning them to the Murshidabad court, imprisoning them in order to extract more from them. Now, Brijan Gupta otherwise is correct in emphasizing the way Siraj actually had to go on warpath against the company for a number of reasons. But to say that the crisis of the Bengal polity had begun at the time when this new dynasty had just emerged is to overemphasize this aspect of alienation between Murshid Quli and some of his landlords or some of his zamindars. We know from other sources, from other historians, that until Alibardi's time, the political system in Bengal was fairly stable. So there was something to do with Siraj's personality. There was something to do with the way the young man was not able to retain its control over the body politic in the way his grandfather did. Alibardi knew that the British were actually showing defiance against them. Alibardi knew that the British were plotting with some people from within the Murshidabad court, from within the Murshidabad family, polity. But still, Alibardi was capable of holding them in check, something which Siraj failed. So Alibardi was always very careful about imposing these restrictions on them, even though when some of his advisors, some of his courtiers had advised Alibardi Khan to throw the British out of Bengal by using the French against them, Alibardi refrained from doing that. Alibardi didn't wish to become dependent on either of the two contending European companies. But Siraj was very decisive about taking on the company, because Siraj came to realize that the company was not paying him the required obeisance that all of these Oriental rulers or Indian rulers or all rulers for that matter would actually demand from their subjects or from their inhabitants. Even though the company was not a subject of the Nawab, the company was inhabiting the realm in which he was the sovereign. Fortification was not merely strengthening the Fort William with new ammunitions or new arms or with new contingents of forces. Fortification was a symbolic defiance against the Nawab's authority in his own country, in his own land. So this is one reason why Siraj was very angry with the way this fortification business was going on. In addition, Siraj was receiving frequent complaints from local merchants that the British were misusing the privileges of duty-free trade. Khoja Wazeh, an Armenian merchant, was close to the Nawab family, complained regularly about such nefarious designs by the British officials in their private trade. And lastly, taking advantage of their stronger position in Calcutta, the way Fort William in Calcutta was fortified, and the British felt that they were becoming stronger than the French, and the British found that they had the ability to defy the Nawab's authority. They were also actually giving asylum to the fugitives who were escaping the Nawab's justice. So you do not look at the question of fortification merely as an attempt by the company to strengthen the fort in order to protect themselves from French invasion or French assaults, but it became linked with a systematic attempt by the East India Company to defy the authority of a Nawab at a very critical juncture when they realized that Alivardi was not there, the more seasoned person was not there, the young man was going to do mistakes, and the mistakes, the company and their friends will take advantage of the mistakes to unseat him. So if you look at these issues, the question of private trade, question of fortification, the way Siraj felt insulted by this practice of extending asylum to fugitives who were escaping the Nawab justice, then you can explain why this conflict became inevitable. And it began with the sack of Calcutta in June 1756. Incensed by these attitudes of defiance, Siraj came down to Calcutta, took Fort William for a while, forced the British inhabitants to flee to a safer distance at Falta, a few miles downstream from Calcutta. But then Siraj did not consolidate its gains. He renamed the city as Alinagar and left for Murshidabad. And he went back to Murshidabad in order to prepare for his defense against a possible invasion of Abdali on the borders of Bihar, which was a part of the Bengal Suba. But then Abdali's invasion never happened. And the company got the time to work out their plots. And this is where the conspiracy becomes relevant. The company began to link up with disgruntled courtiers. The company began to link up with traders and bankers like Jagat Seth, who had become unhappy with the doings of some of the doings of Siraj-ud-Dawla. And they got the man, Mir Jafar Ali. Zafar was willing to pay compensations to the company. Zafar was willing to act in accordance with the men who wished to place him on the throne by excluding Siraj-ud-Dawla. And the conspiracy began to bear fruit, ultimately in the Battle of Plassey. It was not a battle at all. Nobody gave the battle except Mir Madan and Mohan Lal. But their heroic struggle actually had no results, because a huge contingent of the Nawab's army stood still under the command of Mir Jafar and Rai Durlab. And the result was that Plassey remained a skirmish. As far as military engagements were concerned, it had no significance. It remained a skirmish, but politically extremely important. But I would still argue that if Plassey was a skirmish and it ultimately removed Siraj-ud-Dawla, who had to die a very tragic death, at the instance of Mir Jafar, his son, who actually intrigued, and his son was responsible for his murder. But then Buxar, the second battle in 1764, was, I would consider this to be a more decisive battle. Because still the Bengal Nawabs, despite the fact that the nominees, the men like Mir Jafar and Mir Qasim, were all appointed by the company, or nominated by the company, or at least nominated with the approval of the company, still they got the opportunity, or they had the opportunity. They occasionally showed signs of discomfort with the kind of informal overlordship that the company was exercising over Bengal. Mir Jafar was put on the throne after Siraj's removal, and he was known as the jackass of Lord Clive. He would do whatever Clive would ask him to do. And Clive, as you know, came to the company's rescue from South India with a force from Madras during that intervening period between the sack of Calcutta and the Battle of Plassey. And Clive participated regularly, very closely in the negotiations during this intervening period, and agreed to Mir Jafar's candidature or Mir Jafar's nomination on conditions that Mir Jafar would give to the company access to revenue rights in certain regions. Mir Jafar would actually ensure appointments of the friends of the company in crucial administrative positions. So Clive was insistent on protecting the power and privileges of their friends at Murshidabad, and Mir Jafar accepted it. But then, after a while, he began to feel that he was a ruler without the rod to rule. So he became somewhat uneasy. He began to plot with others. He began to send overtures to other Europeans in order to achieve a little bit of independence, which the company was not in a mood to give. So Mir Jafar was removed, and his son-in-law Mir Qasim was installed again with the same kind of conditions. Mir Qasim, as you know, soon realized that South Bengal was out of the Nawab's purview, or out of Nawab's real authority, because you have the 3 revenue districts were ceded to the company. The company got permanent revenue rights through an agreement with Mir Qasim. It was one of the conditions for which the company gave their support to Mir Qasim. So Mir Qasim's idea was that if South Bengal had completely been taken over by the company because of their commercial networks in that region, because of their control over the channel, Hooghly Channel, because of their location in Calcutta, then it was better for the Nawab of Bengal to consolidate on the north and on Bihar. So he was in a mood to withdraw from South Bengal and consolidate its hold in North Bengal in order to create a genuine political base, or in order to rule as a real ruler. I mean, as far as these districts were concerned where the revenue rights were ceded to the company, Mir Qasim's authority hardly existed. It was the company's authority. So Mir Qasim, in order to prepare for a kind of a genuine authority that he wished to exercise over a more closely knit region of northern Bengal, began to reorganize his government, began to fill important positions with people loyal to him, remove people who were favorites of the company. Jagat Seth actually for some time lost all influence with Mir Qasim's government. Mir Qasim moved from Murshidabad to Munger. He began to increase the size of the army, increase the size of ammunitions, cannons and guns were procured, and eventually, in association with Sujaudullah, the Nawab Wazir of Awadh, he was the Nawab of Awadh, but at the same time he was appointed Wazir by the fugitive Emperor Shah Alam and Shah Alam. These were the 2 allies ultimately Mir Qasim found in order to confront the company, which has been described by historians as the last stand of Mughal resistance in eastern India. And that was to happen at Buxar in 1764, in which Mir Qasim eventually lost. The 3 armies lost. I mean, this combination, this Mughal combination that you find in Buxar, the Shah Alam on the one hand, Nawab Wazir, which is Shujaudullah of Awadh, and Mir Qasim, the Nawab of Bengal, together tried to confront the company, but they didn't succeed. The Battle of Buxar was followed by this Treaty of Allahabad in 1765, in which Mughal Emperor was a signatory to an agreement that would give the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal. So that is the reason why I consider Buxar to be a more decisive event, a more important turning point in the history of British ascendancy in eastern India. From then on, there was no turning around.
But sir, between the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, why is Buxar considered a more decisive event?
That I was trying to explain to you. I mean, that the defeat in Buxar would give the company the right to Diwani. So the company would be accepted as the Diwan of Bengal, and it was accepted by no less than a person the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. Shah Alam makes the company Diwan, his Diwan of Bengal, and the company, it is argued, became a part of the Mughal revenue system, became a part of the Mughal order. Some of these British soldiers or British warriors, the commanders, were given Mughal titles as well. Clive, for example, was known as the victor of war, Sabad Jung. Another person would be given title of Delwar Jung. So they had this habit of acquiring Indian titles from the Mughal aristocracy in order to become a part of the Mughal political order, which the company very successfully did once they negotiated this treaty with Shah Alam at Allahabad and managed to acquire the right to Diwani. But the right to Diwani was significant for other reasons as well. It not merely by giving the company a space in the political system, the Diwani gave the company access to resources which the company started using for purposes of investment. I was talking about this on an earlier occasion of how territorial revenue became an important foundation. And the Diwani is a case in point where not merely the 3 districts, but the entire province of Bengal, including the regions in Bihar and Orissa, which were part of the Bengal Suba, the entire revenue of this province became a monopoly of the British. If you look at the changes in the administration of Bengal between 1765 and 1772, you can see a new order emerging. Not in the very early stage, because in the early stage they would engage Muhammad Reza Khan as their Naib. He was known as the Deputy Nawab or the Naib Nazim and the Naib Dewan. You remember that in the Mughal system, the administrative powers were divided between the Dewan, who was responsible for civil justice and revenue administration, and the Nazim, who was responsible for Nizamat, which was basically responsible for defense, criminal justice, policing, etc. So, by the Treaty of Allahabad with Shah Alam, Diwani was given to the company, the Nizamat was retained with the Nawab. Now, this Nizamat right eventually would be taken away. So, and this is a process which is initiated in 1765. Initially, they would actually function through an Indian person or Indian functionary like Muhammad Reza Khan. But from 1770-72 onwards, after particularly this huge extraction by Muhammad Reza Khan to fulfill the company's expectations of high revenue, will led to the devastating famine, which in Bengali is known as Chiattorer Mononto. This is the great famine of 1769-70. The company decides to take over the revenue administration directly, and that was the beginning. But then you come across legislations like Regulating Act in 1772 and a couple of years later, Pitt's India Act. The Regulating Act creates a board of control appointed by Parliament to keep control or to keep watch over what goes on in Bengal. Pitt's India Act further deepens the control of the home government, the British government and British Parliament on the affairs, companies' rules, companies' activities, companies' government in Bengal. Then the huge resources were used for expanding the army. Soon the company's army in Bengal became 40,000 strong. And that was the moment in the early part of the 1770s that a new framework of governance began to emerge, which would make Buxar, the transfer of Diwani and the chain of events following it, events of far greater moment, events of far greater importance. It created the foundation of a new framework of rule that the company created between 1765 and 1772. So it is not as if the company merely sailed into the Mughal system. The company, while it sailed into the Mughal system, also began to create a new one by the early 1770s. And the huge army that became possible because of this huge revenue resource that the company now had access to became the sword of further advance from Benares westward to Delhi. So that is the significance. This is the reason why Bengal was the British bridgehead. Soon the company would move westwards to Awadh, to Delhi, ultimately to create their huge empire in India.